You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Monday evening, everyone. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on Odyssey Radio Network. And you can go hear the audio at odyssey1.com. That's ODYSY 1.com. You can also join the live stream, which has the live chat room interactive over on my YouTube stream, which is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And of course, Mr. is spelled out M-I-S-T-E-R. Scotty is with a Y, not an I-E. And I-E is for girls. Y is for guys, right? So I'm a guy. So there you go. We've got a little show I want to do tonight that's a break from the seriousness of some of the things I've been doing. And I think hopefully you will enjoy this. Some of you have heard this before, but this is my kind of breaking the ice into getting into doing some more geeky, nerdy shows, if you will, here on the Odyssey Radio Network, which is kind of built around the geeky, nerdy Star Trek, Star Wars, sci-fi, all of those kinds of things. And I haven't done much of that on this program yet. I tend to get a little heavy-handed, a little serious at times. I take my history very seriously. I take life very seriously. But I'm a fun-loving guy, too. Right? So I like to have fun. You could say I'm an academic, scholarly type who also likes to have a good time. And I've got things that... and I'm not going to push that and force that, by the way. What comes naturally comes naturally. If I lapse into getting too emotive or too serious, it's just the way I am. So I need to talk to you, though, a little bit about, I want to share a story about some experiences I had in the Star Trek world. And I grew up on the original series. I was born in 1960. I saw my very first Star Trek episode of the original series back in the mid to late 1960s. The very first episode I saw, and I wasn't engaged in the episode. I was just a 6 or a 7-year-old kid, and but I saw playing where we were visiting somebody's house, Star Trek, the episode Shore Leave. And those of you who are into Star Trek know what Shore Leave was, what the whole plot was, and so on. And the first thing that caught my eye, I remember, I saw the back end of the big white rabbit that McCoy saw, and I also remember I don't remember her rank off the top of my head, but the female cast member, not a regular cast member, crew member, she was in the princess outfit with the little pointy hat and the veils and all of that, and the knight in shining armor that ran McCoy through with his lance. I remember all of that from when I was a little kid, and I don't know if that... I'm thinking that was in its original run that I actually saw that episode. And a couple of years went by before I really got into it again. When I became, turned 8, 9, 10, right in those ages, and Star Trek started in syndication, I started to watch that series very faithfully. And, of course, it played every friggin' day in reruns, every day of the week. And, not Saturdays and Sundays. And so I would watch it every afternoon. I think it was on at 5 in the afternoon. And so I was able to watch every episode of Star Trek at least 100 times while I was growing up. And so that generally has given me a pretty good database in my brain of old Star Trek, original Star Trek stuff. And, of course, Captain Kirk was my hero. He was the guy I grew up with that was the hero. And I did write some pretty serious stuff on the surrogates that we use as kids that either help you cope with pain issues or abuse issues or so on, and the things that we pull in as surrogates from usually entertainment. There are heroes. Very few kids sit and read history and pull heroes out that become surrogates, like surrogate fathers for their saddened situations or the situations they're in, or psychological coping mechanisms. What we usually pull those from are from entertainment, the characters that we either read about or watch on television or see in the movies or so on. And that's what Kirk was for me. I grew up with Kirk as my hero. I mean, I wanted to emulate him. I wanted to talk like him. I was hoping to God I would grow up and look like him. And you were on very shaky ground with me if you insulted the captain or his ship or the show. I would be like Scotty was in The Trouble with Tribbles. Remember that? And they're at the starbase, and the Klingons are there as well. And Scotty didn't make a move to start a fight. He held all the men back until they started insulting the Enterprise. And I remember Kirk with that. He says, and that's when you threw the first punch? And so that's kind of the way I was with the entire show, the entire series. And, of course, with Captain Kirk. And I was nerdy enough back in those days to have made my own Star Trek uniforms, worn them to school. And, I mean, I'm talking makeshift. I'm talking, sweatshirts that you drew black collars on with magic marker because you didn't know how to sew. And made patches out of, little bits of cardboard and used gold glitter, and drew the black stars. And, you glue them to your shirt and you go to school that way. And people thought I was a big nerd. Well, because I was. And it wasn't until I was a little older, I was in my teens a few years later, before I actually got the patterns and sewed my own shirt. From Star Trek. And the only fabric I could find that was the velour that they used on those original shirts was red. So I went as a red shirt. And the first time I ever made one of those was in the mid-'70s. It had to be 74 or 75, when Gene Roddenberry himself was doing his Star Trek Live, I think it was called. He was doing his touring around the country, trying to revive Star Trek. And with the fan base that was supporting that. And so we went to see Star Trek Live with Gene Roddenberry, a buddy of mine and I. And I remember building a tricorder out of, I don't know what kind of wood I used. It wasn't balsam wood, but they didn't have any of these toys back then. Like you can get now. You can buy, you can spend $150 and buy a prop quality filming quality tricorder and phaser and communicator these days. You can see I've got one of the phasers on my wall. My camera's a little too high. But I used to have the whole array of phasers, all the different phases of the phasers, up on my weapons wall here with my swords and my old musket. And I've just got the one on there now. And, of course, I've got my... Here, let me step away from the camera. And, of course, those of you on the radio, you can't see any of this. Sorry about this. This is for my simulcast, my live video audience. But this has no batteries in it at the moment, but this was the old communicator. And I don't think it has batteries. Oh, yeah, it does. It should have the... There it is when you flip it open. So there you go. That was the old communicator. Kirk to Enterprise, blah, blah, blah. So we didn't have these things when I was a kid. And so we made them out of things. We handcrafted stuff. And I remember going to this Inside Star Trek, I think it was called, with Gene Roddenberry. And we had our uniforms that we made. We bought the patches, the official patches and braid through, I think it was Lincoln Enterprises. Those of you who are old enough, I think that was Majel Barrett's company, Majel Barrett Roddenberry, her company to buy memorabilia. And so that's what we did as a kid. And Kirk was my hero, as I mentioned, and all we were waiting for was a revival of Star Trek. Come on, Gene, get it done. Let's see a revival of Star Trek. And so into my teen years, and it was my freshman year in college, the 78-79 school year, that they finally came out with the first motion picture. and Star Trek the Motion Picture. And I remember that was, to all of us Star Trek geeks and nerds, that was like a slice of heaven come down to earth. And so I remember watching that. It was a little slow and tedious, but it was Star Trek. And we were all like, oh my God, I hope this survives and they do more movies. It was a little long, and the director had put an extra lot of time into his visuals. The story was okay. It was like a Star Trek episode. It was nothing really big league outside of the original series, the storyline itself. But that's where they started introducing things like the Kolinar, Spock going into seclusion and trying to eschew all emotion and go totally logical. So all of these things happened in those interim years. And then, of course, what happened in 1982? You had the release of Star Trek The Wrath of Khan. And that's where they went from what they did with, as most of you who are Star Trek fans know, they had this Phase 2 they were going to be working on for television back in the late 70s. And it never got off the ground. But they had some of the set development, the uniform development, all that's what you saw in Star Trek The Motion Picture. Modifications of that. And then, of course, they came out with Wrath of Khan, which was the whole new ball game. I remember the new flashy, the red uniforms, with the little flap and the shoulder strap that buttoned, and the new sets, and everything was just amazing. And that launched that whole new era of the Star Trek franchise. And they went into, 11 movies, 12 movies, motion pictures? And, of course, the remakes by J.J. Abrams. Those of you who are Star Trek geeks and fans, you remember the J.J. Abrams movies were just freshly out of those. I thought they were going to do another one, and then, of course, not for this show, we'll talk about it sometime, but all the contract disputes, money disputes, everything's about money. Money and rights and this and that and this and that. There's things that are done for the fans, but the fans are always second place, it seems, to actually getting the financial, the business side of these things done. And so that didn't come off very well. Then, of course, we have all the advents of all the different shows. Star Trek The Next Generation. I remember when that hit the airwaves. It was 1988. So I was a 27-year-old guy by the time that came out. And we were just elated that series was hitting the air. And it came out, and the first few episodes, that first season, as we all know, was a big hit and miss. It was like, is this going to survive past one season? They had the great new captain, which was very different captain from Kirk. And you wondered, is this going to make it? And we kept making the comparisons. Oh, Data is the Spock character. Oh, Captain Picard is kind of new, so the Kirk character is being pulled off in Riker. And who is playing who? And, that's the look and the feel, and that's the way we were making those comparisons. And, of course, over its run, what did Star Trek The Next Generation run? For 7 years, I think. And throughout that run, it established itself. It got its own legs. And it eventually got through the writer's strike, which happened in the first season. And so the episodes were kind of schmaltzy. Really bad lines. I remember one line I heard from Riker. He's sitting on the bridge, and he says something like, it wasn't fortune favors the foolish. It was a line like that, and I can't remember it. This is off the top of my head. I didn't pre-plan this line, but he says, to something and ships named Enterprise. And I thought, oh my God, that is a schmaltzy, campy line. Can the writers not do better than that? And then, of course, we realized later they were going through a writer's strike in Hollywood. So the first season made it, and it made it to the second season. I liked the uniforms when they got out of the Lycra collarless bit, and they got into the uniforms with the collar, and they were kind of coats, and they started to get their own legs and everything. Set design, stories got pretty amazing. And it was during that period that I really started to not lose the affinity I had for Kirk as a kid, but where it started to morph into really understanding the series, less from a hero worship as a little kid of the captain to understanding the series, understanding the actors and what they brought to their roles. I wanted to know the behind-the-scenes stuff. I wanted to get to know things on that level. I wanted to make that kind of movie and that kind of series. I wanted to write. I wanted to design. I wanted all of that. And that was in my late 20s, my early 30s. And now as the next generation started coming to its final years, I had been reading, and I had read it as a kid, and I reread it, David Gerrold's book, The Making of Star Trek. If you remember that book, it came out in the 70s, early 70s, I believe. And David Gerrold was the author, the writer who wrote the Trouble with Tribbles episode. And he wrote a book called The Making of Star Trek. And he talked about all the different behind-the-scenes issues that had gone on. And he made mention in one section of the book, and it kind of stuck with me, that from time to time there were contests they had during the original run of the original series in the 60s, where people could come and visit the sets and watch filming for a day and things like that, meet the actors. And I remember him talking about that. I thought, man, what an experience that would have been when I was a 12 or 13-year-old kid when I was reading his book, The Making of Star Trek. I thought, man, that would be awesome. I couldn't imagine. And of course, at that time, I knew there are no more sets. They aren't making this show anymore. You can't visit that. But I thought, what an experience to have had. And as I grew a little older and, got into Next Generation and so on, we started doing business. I had a small company of my own, and we were doing business trying to sell some properties to some animation studios out in L.A. And in 1994, I took a suit and tie trip out to L.A. With a couple of partners and things, and we had some animation properties that we were working on selling to Warner Brothers and some other places. And while we were going out to L.A., I contacted a good friend of mine who you'll know, I'll mention him in a minute here, to see if he could get us in to visit the Star Trek The Next Generation sets in L.A. on the Paramount backlots. And of course, what was going through my mind at that time was having read David Gerrold's book, The Making of Star Trek, and knowing that people, at least at certain times, got to visit sets. And I thought, is this even possible to do? So I have a good friend. He's been my friend since, I think Dan and I met in 1982 or 83. That's how far back it is, and that would make it, what is 82 or 80? That's like 35 years ago to 36 years ago when I met Dan. And Dan Madsen, at the time, was publishing the Star Trek Fan Club newsletter. And it was just, regular sheet of paper folded in half, several pages long, stapled, and a Xeroxed off in black and white. And it was Dan's effort. If you know Dan, you know this story already. And I've interviewed him on the Rocky Stucci Situation Room. We'll probably get him back on this show in the very near future. But he published the Star Trek Fan Club newsletter. And he got interviews with Roddenberry and some of the actors and things like that. He was just a kid who didn't grow up on Star Trek. He's about my age, but he didn't get into it until it was in syndication in the 70s already. And he was so into the series. I don't want to tell his story. If you already know his story, you know him. If you've heard the interview I did with him in recent months, you know some of his story. But Dan is a little person. He's a dwarf. And he wasn't into Star Trek at all. And there was one day his brother was watching it, and he thought, I got nothing else to watch. And he watched it. He ended up watching his very first Star Trek episode. For those of you geeks know this by the title, Plato's Stepchildren. And there was the very famous dwarf actor in Hollywood that was in that episode, and I don't remember his name. off the top of my head. But Dan remembers a scene in that episode where Kirk, and first of all, he noticed it's another little person, and it drew him in, and Kirk talking to him in the episode and saying things like, where I come from. He says, the shape of your body, the size you are, so it doesn't matter. It's character, it's this and that, and all the Star Trek isms that you'd want to throw into that episode. And Dan said it absolutely enthralled him, and he was sucked right into that. And Star Trek became his favorite series. And of course, he went on to publish the Star Trek newsletter, which was his own effort, out of his own pocket, out of his folks' basement. And then he got these interviews with some of the big names, and it was after the series was already over, and it was in syndication, and so he was getting Gene Roddenberry and some of the actors, and then he eventually started getting so noticed that he got a cease and desist letter from Paramount saying, this is copyrighted material, you cannot use it. And of all people, Gene Roddenberry went to bat for Dan, and the outcome of that was he got the official licensure from Paramount to do the official Star Trek fan club newsletter. And it became a color, glossier magazine, and then he went into the Communicator magazine, which you've probably seen over the years. He also went on to publish magazines like the Lord of the Rings magazines. He went on the Indiana Jones magazines, the Star Wars official fan club magazines, the Insider magazines, all of these things, Lucasfilms. And Dan built a little empire right there out of Aurora, Colorado. And at his highest point before he ended up selling the business, after he did the Lord of the Rings stuff, was he had over 150 employees working for him. And so it was Dan I contacted. I met him through the magazine back in 1982, and I was out in Aurora, Colorado, and I called him up and said, I'd love to meet you. We became fast friends, and we've been friends for years now. Well, it was Dan that I contacted in 1994 when I was heading out to L.A. to do business, and I said, Dan, what is the possibility of getting in to visit the Star Trek sets? Do you have any pull in that area? And he said, sure, let me make some phone calls. When do you want to go? and I was unbelievable. It was like Star Trek boner time for me. And so Dan lined that all up for me, and we went out and visited, while we were doing business in L.A., we went out and visited the Star Trek sets for The Next Generation. And for those of you who've heard this story, enjoy it again a second time. If you haven't heard this, enjoy it. This was my brush with living Star Trek, if you will. If you can say walking on the sets of Star Trek The Next Generation was about the next best thing you could do to living the fantasy. And of course, by this time, I was already in my mid-30s. But I was still as much a geek and a nerd back then. And now we got to go out to break, so I'm going to tell the story of visiting the sets when we come back after this. You sit tight, 2 minutes. I'll be right back, and we'll get into this story. Hang on. All right, folks, welcome back from that break. Thanks for hanging on. Thanks for still being here. I hope to regale you with a great story here. Those of you who've heard it before go, "Oh, Grandpa's telling his story again." Those of you who haven't heard it, enjoy it. And this is Scotty Roberts, by the way. You're listening to the second segment of the Intrepid radio program, and it's right here on the Odyssey Radio Network, broad network. We're doing all kinds of internet stuff, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, all of those things. There's terrestrial stations that we air on, and you can come and listen to the audio at odyssey1.com. That's ODYSY1.com. And also come over and join me in my simulcast, my live video simulcast over on, where is it? YouTube.com. Mr. Scotty Roberts. That's my channel. So come and look it up and join in the live chat room, and we can talk about this stuff as the show is going on. And enjoy either the audio or the video stream. If you only are listening to audio tonight, you can come over anytime to my YouTube channel and watch the video stream. All right, let's get back into this story. So there I was in 1994. We were all, by all I say, I had two partners I was doing some business with, and I had done some comic book publishing back in the 1980s, and I had developed some properties for animation. They were going to be comic book properties to do comic book series with, but we revamped them a bit, and I did some animation cells. Now, this is way before they really started getting into digital computer graphic generated, like you think of Shrek, you think of movies like that. They're all animated digitally now, but or Toy Story, things like that. But go back to the days when it was all hand cell animation. So I had done up some mock-up hand cell animations where I painted the backgrounds and I had the clear acetate on which I drew some of the characters and so on. And so I put a few of those together, and we put a bunch of properties together and proposals. And what we were doing was out seeing if we could sell these properties to some of the major animation networks that were out there. And of course, one of them was that we stopped by was Warner. And we met with them, and they were talking about budgets, like, well, this needs, doesn't seem like as much anymore these days, but they were talking about like needing a $2 million budget. And this is back in 1994. And we're like, fantastic. And then he said, okay, if you bring in $2 million, we'll match the rest. And I go, oh, wait a minute, we got about $2 to work with. So some of the things I presented them never quite got off the ground. But I will say this, and I have to mention this, I'm making no accusations here against anybody, but the guy we met with at Warner, and I believe it was he who became in charge of when Cartoon Network came out and started doing their stuff. I had presented a little property that I entitled The Ventura Boys. And the reason what I had done was I had taken the ideas of taking like what I grew up with, Johnny Quest, mixing it with a bunch of other sci-fi stuff. And so I came up with the storyline was twin brothers who had access to world travel through their widowed father. Of course, there I had to use the Disney theme. One parent, or two or one at least, had to be dead. Widowed father who was quite wealthy and worked in world security. And so they flew everywhere around the world, and they didn't go to traditional school. They had a tutor that lived with them. Think Johnny Quest and Race Bannon. Well, I wanted the female version of that, so I had a female version of a Race Bannon character, who was, of course, because it was comic books, hot and sexy, but at the same time like a ninja. And so she was there to be bodyguard, to be the tutor to the boys. They had, instead of a dog, Bandit, like they had in Johnny Quest, they had a robot. And he was like a pre-C-3PO. When I look back at the sketches I did, he really is reminiscent of a C-3PO, except he was green and didn't look anything like C-3PO. And so I got these boys. The storylines were all science fiction. It's meant to be present day, but in the slight future. And all the stuff they would get into, the nemesis they had. His father had nemesis that were out there, and constant enemies. And they were in this world insecurities and things like that. And so all these adventures they got into with their world travel. And so that was one of my properties, one of many that I had presented that day. Many, a handful. And so it was interesting that several years later when Cartoon Network came out, and this same executive from Warner was now involved with Cartoon Network, that they came out with a series of their own called The Venture. Remember, mine was the Ventura Brothers? Or the Ventura Boys, mine was called. And they came out with the Venture Brothers, or the Venture Boys, I think it was called. Almost an identical theme. And I remember at the time I was a little like, wow, did somebody steal my property? And it had been a few years, it was 10 years later, but you can't really, there's nothing to go on there. I just knew that the guy that I met was the executive producer on this new series, and it seemed an awful lot. It's not that somebody couldn't come up with the same idea. It just looked an awful lot like the stuff I presented in the drawings I presented him, the preliminary work and so on. But that's neither here nor there now. But that was what we were doing in 94 out in L.A. We went to, I think in 1 day, 2 days, we visited 13 different animation houses, from the biggies to the smallies. And we were presenting things, and we were trying to figure out budgets and how to make things work and so on. So while we're out there, I had asked Dan Madsen, my friend who published the Star Trek magazines, if he could get us in to visit the Star Trek sets. Now, my partner that I was out there with wasn't a Star Trek fan. No big shakes to him. But he was into production, movie production, things like that. So he was very interested by it all, without being a Star Trek fan. But me, I was the walking boner when it came to Star Trek. So we got out to the sets. I remember we got to the back lot of Paramount and the big gate, and at about 4 or 4:30 in the afternoon on a Friday. And in a few minutes, up comes a guy in a golf cart. And some of you who are Star Trek geeks may know who this is. At the time, I think he was more or less a glorified gopher. I don't know if he was on the production staff or team at that time. Young guy. His name was David Rossi. And David Rossi, I have seen in credits in subsequent years. Just a few years ago, saw his name in the credits of some of the big Star Trek movies. And so, as on the production staff, one of the producers. And so, if I remember that correctly, I don't want to misquote anything here. But so he moved up the ranks at Paramount and in Star Trek. Well, he came, picked us up in a golf cart. We were all happy and talking, and we were all dressed in suits and ties because we had just come from big business meetings, And so we're riding down, and he brings us first to this big hangar. He says, rather than the sets, he says, they're not filming on the sets today. He says, but let's take you into the big hangar first because they're filming down in the cave scenes. And so the caves and things like that, planet surfaces, they build all this stuff inside these big jumbo, they look like Quonset huts, except they're 1,000 times bigger. You could fit 747s in them. And so they had, the caves were all dug out of the ground underneath there, and sets were built. And so we walked in, and there's a big pit, and there's 2x4 railings just slapped together so you wouldn't fall in. And separating also, there were a bunch of makeup tables and mirrors where the actors could go get their makeup done. And so we're looking down into the pit there, and David's pointing out, see, they're down there, they're working on the lighting right now. You could see the cameras set up and all the lights, and they were trying to get mist in the air to work or something like that. So it was really cool seeing that. They weren't actually filming at the moment. They were just working on tech for a scene that they were going to start filming. And out in front of us, right away, arm's reach, we're leaning on this 2x4 railing, were some of the actors that played aliens and stuff in this particular episode. And if you remember, I don't remember the Robin Curtis, was that her name? Remember Kirstie Alley played Savick in The Wrath of Khan. And then they replaced her with Robin Curtis as Savick. And then Savick played the same, Robin Curtis played other aliens in the Next Generation series. And she was right in front of me. She was playing a Romulan, I think, or a Vulcan. And she was in heavy makeup, and they were laughing and talking, all the actors there getting their makeup done, just a few feet in front of us, and we're just chatting away and watching them. They weren't interacting with us. And then we're standing there with David Rossi, and then over about 40 feet away from me, Patrick Stewart walks by, and he's talking with the director. And he's got his head down, he's kind of nodding, and they're just walking by about 40 feet away from us. And he's in full costume. And David said, "Hey, would you like to meet Patrick?" And I was like, "Would I?" You know? And he says, "Okay, you guys wait right here." He says, "I'll be back in a few minutes, and I'm going to go talk to them." And so he took off, and they all went outside the hangar. And so we're standing there talking and looking. Then he comes back, and he says, "All right, come on." He says, "Come on with me." He says, "I will introduce you." And so we walked outside. It's about 10 minutes later, and there outside the door in the shadow of the building sits Patrick Stewart, full costume. He's got a script on his lap. I'm sure he's thinking, "Oh, great, I got to meet fans." And they probably loved it on one hand, and on the other hand, hated it. I'm working, I'm doing my thing, I'm serious here. But he's reading his script, and David brings us over, and he goes, "Patrick." And he looks up, and he says, "I would like to introduce you to my friend Scotty," and the guy I was with. Notice I've just brushed that off. He didn't matter anymore. And Patrick Stewart, he stood up, and he says, "Well, hello, how are you?" And he's extended his hand, and he says, "Welcome." And I go, "Well, thank you." I said, "It's great to be here." I said, "I'm an old-time Star Trek fan," and I said, "I had the opportunity to come by." I said, "It was Dan Madsen." And, yes, I know Dan Madsen. And so I said, it's great being here. This is a lot of fun. And I didn't want to be, got going through my head, I'm not going to be the typical geek. In episode 47, where you did this, how are you feeling about that? I didn't want to go there. So I tried to maintain, and we looked businesslike, suits and ties. And so a few months earlier, Patrick Stewart had produced a play that they were touring around the country at different theaters. And this play was called Every Good Boy Deserves Favor. And it was about, really the theme was third world dissidency. And I believe he had Brent Spiner, Data, had joined him in that play, and Colm Meaney, Engineer O'Brien, and a couple of other people from Star Trek were part of the cast. And so a lot of Star Trek fans went to see this not caring what the theme was. And it was one thing that hit my brain was that I could bring that up and then not seem like such a geek. And so I said, a few months ago, I saw your play that you wrote and directed and produced, and you were playing up at the University of Minnesota campus at the Northrop Auditorium. I said, Every Good Boy Deserves Favor. And Patrick Stewart's eyes went like this. He went, "Really? You saw it?" He says, "What did you think?" And I was like, so I gave him a quick 10-second critique. I thought it was great. I thought the theme was great and this and that. And, I found it pithy and perspicacious and gave it a hearty thumbs up. I don't even remember what I said to him. But I prattled on for a minute or two about it and told him it was very good. It was fabulous. And he was like, immediately that broke the ice a little bit because we were talking about something that wasn't Star Trek, wasn't what he was working on right there at the moment, but some of his other work, his theatrical work. And so we only got about 10 minutes with him. He was busy and, we couldn't take up all of his time, but it was great to meet him. So I got to meet Patrick Stewart. Actually, I'll tell you this quietly. I got to meet Captain Picard because he was in his uniform and everything. And by the way, they were filming that day. If you remember The Next Generation, they were filming a 2-part episode where Picard went undercover as a mercenary archaeologist with this rogue mercenary ship filled with all these different kind of aliens. If you remember that was, I think, mid to late in the 1994 season. And it was a 2-part episode. And so that was the day I met him when they were working on that particular set of episodes. I don't know if they were on the first part or the second part, but they were filming that day for that. So that was fabulous. I got to meet, it wasn't meeting my hero, Captain Kirk, but it was meeting Captain Picard, who I had a lot of respect for in an entertainment sense as well as the storyline sense. And so while we're while we're there, he also now took us from the hangar after we met Stewart and took us over. He said, we're going to go look at the ship sets now. And he says, nobody's in there. He said, there is a crew that is working on the lighting for filming in the engineering room, but we'll get there, and we'll talk about it when we get there. And so we walked into the studio. It was dark, and there were some lights, and you could see, but the main lights were all off, and you could see the outside of the bridge. I could see the set built in the 2x4s and all of that, and of the Enterprise. And so David said, wait here. And he disappears into the set somewhere, and you hear this big chunk, and all the lights come up. And he says, okay, come on in here. And he comes out this little door on the side of the sets. And so he says, come on in here. And we walk in through this little door. And the door was actually in the wall behind Picard's desk in his ready room, his office off the bridge. And so we walked in there. And the first thing I saw, his big desk, his chair. You could see the big round aquarium over on the other side of the room. I'm in Picard's office, his ready room. And so the fish was still alive. David told me a little anecdotal thing. He says, we're in our 7th season. He says, that's the same fish that was here the first day we started. He says, that fish has been alive through the whole series. So that was cool. Well, then the door to the bridge is open, and so we walk out onto the bridge. And I'm like, oh my God. I'm just like in awe. I'm like, I am on the Enterprise. And they had the only thing that, was very noticeable was the front view screen of the bridge was pulled way out because they bring the cameras in there to film toward the chairs and the big swooping control panel up on the top. And all of that, by the way, the chairs and that big swoop, they were all covered with a kind of a khaki-colored canvas that was form-shaped, just sewn to shape. And David says, here, help me. And so we took the canvas and we rolled that all back so it would reveal everything. And he says, I know you. He says, you want to sit in the captain's chair. I said, do I? And so I sat in the captain's chair and gave the obligatory, engage, make it so, number 1. And so I got to sit in the captain's chair, and then I sat in the other chairs too, and I went up on the upper deck there with the big swoop where Worf stands up there, and got to walk all around the bridge. Walked into the turbo lift, which of course didn't go anywhere. I said, something like, 10 forward, and it didn't go anywhere. But then the other side was the briefing room that they have off the bridge, and the big windows. And, of course, you saw stars. That isn't all digital in the series, or post. They had big chains and, not gurneys, I don't know, the tracks up there. They had these enormous 40-foot tall by, 50-foot wide swaths of black velvet. And on the black velvet, they had taken like rhinestones and chipped glass and glued it all over. And so when you saw the stars slowly floating by the windows, not the warp, that was all special effects done in post, but just the stars when they're orbiting a planet and you see them float slowly by the windows, that was all actual. And he said, there's no lights on those. All we did was we moved at a very slow speed along the chain up top, moved the background. And it was ambient light in the studio that made the stars twinkle. They didn't even have to light the thing. And so it was very cool seeing how some of that worked. And then I, of course, got into the hallway, the big curved hallway, walked down all the hallways. I said I have to run down the hallway. And so I had to run down the hallway. We were in medical, in sick bay, and I had to lay on one of the beds and look at everything there. And the transporter room went up, and I had to stand on the transporter. Got to do that. And one thing about the old transporter, or the next generation transporter, I guess it's old now. That series is 30 years ago. But so I stood on the transporter, and he said, if you'll note over your head, he said, there are round glass plates. He says, that's the only homage to the original sets from the 1960s. He says, those glass plates over your head were the plates that were the foot plates in the transporter in the original series. So that was cool, a little bit of history there. And so then we went down the hall to... and by the way, when we first entered the sets, we entered through the shuttlecraft bay, which also is the cargo bay and all of that. And you see a lot of the accoutrements pushed aside, but they had tables with food all set up. That was where the commissary was that day for all the actors to eat there. And so we saw the shuttlecraft bay. It just looked like a big garage when we walked into it. So now we get to engineering. And he said, now remember, they're working on engineering. They're working on the lighting. And if you guys know what engineering looks like, it has the big pulsing warp engine. And it's got the sound, all of that, which is all done in post. And but they had it all theatrically lit for filming. So what was not done in post effects, all the panels were lit up. The engine was pulsing the blue, the big warp engine, and although no sound from it. And we didn't see anybody. It was just all lit up. And so we couldn't go all the way into engineering room. He took us in the back way where they had what he said they called the pool table. It would be that table that was there in engineering. You'd walk a few feet forward, and was Geordie would sit at the little desk there, and then you could walk past the glass walls, and you're in the engineering section with the core. And so we got about 12 feet from the core. It was about as close as we could get. And so there we were. We were there. I was there on the Enterprise. And it was an amazing experience. The only sad thing is we couldn't take any pictures. So I have no photographic memory of it or memorabilia of it, just my memory. And so that was my experience with visiting the sets of The Next Generation. Dan Madsen got me in to see them back in 94. Saw all the sets. We spent about an hour and a half on the Enterprise, just walking around looking at things. And David Rossi, bless his heart, gave us all the time we wanted. And so we were able to do that. And I got to meet Patrick Stewart that day. And that's my one little bit of geek storydom that should hopefully whet your appetites for some other things that we're going to be talking about. Hopefully this week, to lighten up the mood from all the heaviness of the historical shows we did last week. And I hope you enjoyed that story. But we're at the end of the show. So I want to thank you for being here. Come back tomorrow. We'll be talking about more of this kind of thing right here on my show. I'm Scotty Roberts. You've been listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on Odyssey Radio Network, simulcast on my YouTube stream, Mr. Scotty Roberts. Thanks for being here. See you tomorrow night.